let's talk about the Bostrom and Roach. So these are contemporary philosophers who specialize in the ethics of enhancement. So this is at the intersection of biomedical ethics, thinking about the rights and responsibilities of the doctor-patient relationship and the development of technology in medicine. And because it's focusing on the development of technology in medicine, these are also specialists in just the ethics of technology. Okay, so how technology impacts our relationships to one another and how it relates to just society in general. Okay, so for this piece, it's actually a really long article, but thankfully for us, the relevant bit is in the first 7 pages. So that was your requirement for this week. There are a few distinctions that I'm going to go over that are relevant for us. So that's basically what we're going to go through. 3 major distinctions. The first one is between therapy and enhancement, right? So when we're talking about ethics of enhancement, we want to know what makes something an enhancement versus just other things we can do to our bodies. In medicine, the typical way we distinguish therapy and enhancement, therapy, we're fixing something that's wrong, right? So this could be surgery when your gallbladder just starts producing bile and gallstones. Did I call it a gallbladder? I did. Okay. So gallbladders go wrong and they start making you unhealthy. So we could do surgery for that. We could do medications for that. So something is kind of quote unquote broken, and therapeutic interventions try to fix that. Okay. So that's what we call in medicine a therapeutic intervention, right? Yeah, you can think of other things on your own. If you have a rash and you need ointment, therapeutic intervention. There are varieties, right? But it's fixing something that's wrong medically. An enhancement, the rough definition, it's making you better than well. It's an intervention that makes you go beyond, and now we need quotes, your natural or your normal state. Okay, so that's the running definition of therapy versus intervention. Okay, very quickly, that distinction runs into problems. Okay, so there are key and paradigmatic examples of therapy versus enhancement, right? As I said, right, there are clear ways that something's going wrong and we intervene. With enhancement, there are key examples of of something that enhances where nothing's wrong, we're making you better than well, right? So if you don't have ADHD and you're taking Adderall, that's a cognitive enhancement, right? You weren't in need of medical intervention. Actually, you're making yourself better than well. Say if taking the Adderall is like, I'm gonna stay up all night and I'm gonna basically treating it like speed. Okay, cool beans. So we have some problems with this distinction. And in order to understand the problems, we need another distinction. So we could take issue with therapy versus enhancement, either because it's not describing the world well, because when we talk about what therapy and enhancement mean, it's actually not picking out things in the world accurately. So a descriptive issue is saying, look, you're trying to describe the world and you're not, right? So a descriptive issue or just descriptive claims in general are trying to capture what the world is like, okay? It's trying to describe things. So you're just trying to capture the world when you're trying to do something descriptive. On the other hand, we have normative claims. Normative claims are trying to capture what the world ought to be like. So you're not saying, hey, there are 3 chairs at the table. That's a descriptive claim. You're counting chairs. You're saying, here's what the world is like. A normative claim, you say you go into a restaurant and you're a party of 4, and you're saying there ought to be 4 chairs at the table. When you make a normative claim, it's often find that the world isn't like that. That's not a counter to your claim. You're describing what the world ought to be like. There's a party of 4 and there are 3 chairs there. So you're saying there ought to be 4. Okay, so the distinction between descriptive claims and normative claims: descriptive claims trying to capture the world, normative claims trying to capture what the world should be like. Okay, so people take issue with the distinction between therapy and enhancement in two ways. Some folk are upset or take issue with therapy versus enhancement because it doesn't actually track what the world is like. Those are descriptive issues. That's a set of descriptive problems. Some people take issue with the distinction between therapy and enhancement because it's not tracking anything morally relevant. There's nothing different about what you should do because something's therapeutic versus the fact that something's an enhancement, okay? So if we make a distinction between therapy and enhancement, people who have normative issues with this distinction say there's nothing that ought to be the case about therapy versus something that ought to be the case about enhancement, okay? So Bostrom and Roach do, in my opinion, a pretty good job of problematizing the distinction between therapy and enhancement descriptively. Okay, that's not super important for us, but I want us to have the distinction between descriptive and normative just under our belts. So some issues, we're just gonna go real quick, some issues with just making the distinction between what's medically therapeutic and what is an enhancement is just coming up with what counts as a normal or a natural state. Medically, that's incredibly contentious. So in philosophy of biology and philosophy of medicine, what's normal for me is different than what's normal for you, right? This comes up in disability ethics and things like this, right? It's actually just very difficult to say what's a natural state for a human because of differences in individuals, and because one thing that we talked about with how we might become immortal, what's normal or natural for a 2-year-old is different than for a 10-year-old, is different from a 15-year-old, is different than for a 30-year-old, a 50-year-old, and a 70-year-old, right? So even if we fix the issue with what's normal for me is different than normal for you, which is different than normal for someone else, as far as say what a temperature is, what a size of a kidney is, what our memory is, right? That differs from person to person. But say we fix that. It still leaves open, well, what is natural or normal for humans? That differs across aging. And we can't really settle, there's not a normal 2-year-old. If you've ever been around children, there's not. Similarly, there's not a normal 30-year-old, right? There's just, people develop in very different ways. So pick what your age is and compare you laterally across everyone else who is your age. Hopefully a lot of you have noticed that's not the same in terms of these things that I'm talking about. Either we want to go emotional security, maturity, cognitive maturity, height, kidney, you probably don't just chat about kidney function and liver function, but it differs. Okay, so those are descriptive issues with making this distinction between therapy and enhancement. If we don't have a state that is normal or natural, what are we going to call something that's making you better than that? Okay, so the normative problem is if we don't know what counts as enhancement, right, what makes somebody better than well, how are we going to say that it's not okay, it's not morally appropriate to make somebody better than well? Think about all the enhancements that we have in the world, right? Drinking coffee is an enhancement. Contact lenses are enhancements, right? Things get tricky pretty fast with all the ways that we think of are okay to enhance. Depending on how we start chopping it up, using a bicycle is an enhancement. So these are things that Bostrom and Roach are kind of trying to problematize the distinction between what even counts as an enhancement versus just fixing something that's wrong. And if we problematize that distinction, having the actual moral question of, is it okay to change how a human functions, starts becoming really difficult to pin down. So that's the ultimate question we're getting at through these first two distinctions, right? What is therapy versus enhancement, and how difficult it is to actually just describe what that distinction is. So if it's difficult what the distinction is, especially to describe it, then what's normative about it, so why we might be concerned about enhancing people, starts being something that is really hard to get a handle on. So if changing something radically about the human body, so for us, curing aging, isn't like in principle different than drinking coffee, why would we have a moral issue with it, right? If it's difficult to say just what it is to be like physically, biologically, or whatever normal, then why is changing what is normal problematic? Okay, so that's kind of our opening question, and something that we kind of, from Bostrom and Roach perspective, we want to have some kind of answer to. Why are some interventions with our well-being okay versus not okay? So if we just talk about quote unquote like medical interventions that might count as enhancements, it's still a little difficult here, right? There are things that make you better than well in like dentistry, right? You could live perfectly fine, but we still have interventions to get you implants, veneers, like things that might be cosmetic, but they improve your life, right? But not medically. Actually, they're kind of enhancing your life, but usually we don't think that's morally problematic, right? So a lot of cosmetic interventions, it doesn't seem like there's a moral issue with it, but we still would call them enhancement according to this distinction. Yeah, so just thinking in terms of cosmetic stuff that you don't think is morally problematic, right? Okay, cool. Also, the whole field of obstetrics, right? So dealing with pregnancies. It's unclear that you're in need of that medically. And yet it's enhancements, right? So in vitro fertilization, according to this distinction, is an enhancement. You are taking what is a quote unquote natural or normal state, and again, that's a problematic distinction or category, and you're enhancing it. You're making a lot of eggs come out. You're implanting a lot of eggs, right? Most people don't think in vitro fertilization is morally impermissible or morally problematic. Okay, so once we have a category of enhancement, say we've solved these problems, and here's what enhancement is, why would we find it upsetting from a moral perspective? So this is what Bostrom and Roach are kind of building to, right? So we have a category of enhancement, say, but it seems like not all enhancements give us moral pause. Okay, so that's kind of their introduction, and then their article goes through, how about this enhancement? How about this enhancement? How about this enhancement? And their first section deals with radical life extension. And that's kind of, I mean, that's what we're talking about with the postmortal. So obviously in our text, folk are like, let's cure aging. This would obviously be an enhancement according to the Bostrom and Roach nomenclature, how they're breaking down interventions, right? So with life extension, we're making people better than well. We're extending past death, right? Past what maybe we're calling a natural or a normal death. So they talk about how if we cure aging, the life expectancy would be 1,000 years, right? Which is interesting. Again, I want to kind of push on how McGarry is imagining what would happen in a world where aging is cured. So Bostrom and Roach are looking at other processes in human bodies that might cause death, right? It's not just aging that kills us, as we saw other characters in the postmortem get diseases and die. Also, McGarry puts in a lot of violence, given social issues. So one thing I'd like us to keep in mind is this is a narrative, this is literature, and it's based on McGarry's imagining of what's going on. And one of the things that I talk about in my Should We Try to Live Forever class, when I talk about the ethics of immortality in more depth, we talk about we draw on medical experts, we draw on economists and political scientists who have more grounded imaginings of what would happen. And McGarry gets some things that are grounded in those things, and it goes a little differently in other areas. So I just want to keep that in mind. So according to Boston and Roach, people aren't going to live past 1,000 years likely if we do just cure aging. But one of the most important things in curing aging, that 1,000 years is going to increase not just our lifespan, right? It's going to increase what he calls our health span. So we're going to remain healthy for longer. And as we've talked about, whether you want to live forever or not, that is a huge deciding factor, right? So if you imagine if you imagine someone who's like 100 years old, even people who are living happily and well at 100, you might not want to live for 900 years in that condition, right? But increasing a health span for 900 years sounds better, right? So this seems not immediately like a bad idea. So he considers two concerns with life extension. So here's our final distinction, right? We had therapy versus enhancement in order to try to figure out what we mean by enhancement. And then we had descriptive concerns and moral concerns in order to get an idea about what we mean about the morally relevant question, in order to kind of be like, okay, so there are descriptive concerns, but what we're trying to get at is, should we be morally concerned about enhancement? Our final distinction is what Boston and Roach think are the major worries about pursuing life extension, and specifically trying to cure aging. So there are two concerns that they consider to be on the table. The first one is the meaning concern. And they draw on Bernard Williams, a really famous 20th century philosopher who was very concerned about many things, but immortality was one. So this first concern comes from Williams, and it's the meaning objection. So according to Williams, living forever undermines our ability to be committed to the life projects that knowing that you're going to die in a particular time helps us shape. So knowing that there's a finite amount of time allows us to have this narrative structure of conclusion, of a beginning, middle, and end. Because we have a finite amount of projects, it imbues our projects with meaning. So Bernard Williams would look at the Australian traveling the world, and he'd be like, you're living this thinner life. There's nothing at stake with traveling the world, right? He left his wife back in Australia. Everybody's having an infinite number of relationships. So what's at stake in these relationships? For Williams, he thinks an immortal life undermines the significance of any individual project. And he thinks that it just doesn't allow us to shape life projects in a way that we can understand them and we can give them meaning, and in a way that can contribute to the value of our life. He thinks the rarity and the finitude, so the fact that they're not finite, is necessary for the projects to have meaning, and so the projects contribute to the meaning of our lives. Okay, so we can consider the extent to which having an indefinitely extended life has made the projects of our characters thinner, or whether we think our characters have a meaningful life after taking the cure and things like that. Okay, so that's the meaning objection. The other worry that Boston and Roach bring up is the issue of social problems. I suggest this is really what McGarry's concerned about, right? And in your reflections, you're bringing this out really clearly and articulately, right? So with the social issues, right? And here in my other class, we talk about, this is why we're bringing in political scientists and economists and things like this, and actually environmental ethicists, right? And environmental scientists. We're worrying about the economy and overpopulation. primarily, right? One thing to note, Boston and Roche are not as concerned as McGarry seems to be, and I think as most people are in the world. Whenever I talk about this book or this question, people automatically go to, oh my gosh, overpopulation, and there's no way to solve that. If we have too many people, we're just done, right? And environmental ethics is a similar thing. We're going to use up all the resources, and we're screwed, right? And similar with the social problem of the economy, if we just have so many people, the number of people who are living forever are going to block out the young people from entering into the economy. It's going to collapse. Horrible things, right? So those are two main issues that people see with extending life indefinitely. Boston and Roche have responses to these two worries. So the response to the overpopulation problem is kind of twofold. One is, well, actually, if we support the welfare of people, we see a radical decline in birth rate. So overpopulation is not going to be as radical an issue as we currently think it is. And that a bit is borne out, I suggest. You can have a different interpretation, of course. In the postmortal, it's pretty rare to see folk who are just like having all the babies, right? It's difficult to see though in the McGarry because we're seeing things from John's perspective. Also, yeah, we do see some folk wanting babies, and because the way that McGarry is framing this issue is so apocalyptic that we're not, and is from a perspective where there isn't an increase in welfare. So the claim that the more that we support people, the lower the birth rate is difficult to see borne out if we're just in a world where no one's supporting the welfare of folk, right? So in our world right now, that's just always what we see. That is just the trend, is the better supported the population is, the lower the birth rate. So if we have social systems, social safety nets, healthcare, people being provided with contraception and food and stuff, if people have the choice over how many children to have, birth rate goes down. If people have enough food and shelter and work, birth rate goes down. So the worry of overpopulation, for one thing, might be overblown. That's one response to the overpopulation issue. The other response to the overpopulation issue is, okay, say there is one. There are more moral ways to deal with overpopulation than just stopping people from living the lives they want to live, right? So say we have an overpopulation issue right now. Does that mean we should kill a lot of people? Does that mean we should deny healthcare to a whole bunch of people in order to manage our population? So consider your response to the end specialists. Consider your response to just making sure that more people die, having like a culling or something. Maybe a passive one where people are just denied services, or an active one where people are just killed, right? So say we have an overpopulation problem. What is the correct response? Bostrom and Roche say, well, there's concern about to what extent that actually will happen, the overpopulation, but say it does, from an ethical perspective, it's not make sure people die, right? We should be figuring out other solutions. And that's actually what environmental ethicists suggest as well. And they come up with models and things like this, right? So if people are like, there are too many people, they're taking up all the resources, environmental ethicists are like, let's figure out better ways to be sustainable. Let's not just like make less people, right? We can count on the birth rate going lower if we figure out political and economic issues and welfare issues. And also dealing with the populations that we have, we need to increase environmental technology. We need to make political systems better, right? So they want to stop the direct line from overpopulation in moral ways to make fewer people, right? So that's dealing with the overpopulation problem. They have other solutions to the social problems concern, right? Thinking that having a population that's staying around longer, they suggest some reasons that won't put too much of a strain on our economy. I'm not going to go too much into that because I feel like this video is like longer than any video I've sent you before. Yeah, basically, again, more humane ways to deal with things than that quick connection that people normally get. So yeah, this week's reading, we're thinking about the ethical implications of pursuing technology that extends people's lives. We might be worried about just messing with people, right? And so one term for that we've had earlier in the semester, we call them bioconservatives. They think the way that humans are should be the way that humans are. They have the difficulty of defining enhancement and then saying why it's bad, right? So those are bioconservatives. They might say, let's not cure aging, you're screwing around with what humans are naturally. Then the other ones are going to be the transhumanists, who think it's great to improve what humans are. Let's use technology. Let's figure out whether it'd be a good improvement and freaking do it. Okay, so that's Fosterman Roach. You have discussion questions associated with this text. Hopefully they're interesting, connect with the postmortal, and thought-provoking. Let me know if there's anything that I can help with. I hope you're all doing well. Don't forget the nice things discussion, and I'll talk to you soon, maybe from another room. Who can say? Bye.